Greetings. My name is Daniel Mezick. I have a few opinions about how things usually go well, and I'm happy to share them with you here on the podcast.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm this episode's host, Jay Hersko, and joined with me is fellow Brad member Brad Stokes. Brad, g'day.
Hey.
And the topic of tonight's episode, today's episode, is we're going to talk about the OpenSpace Agility. And joining us is the author of the book himself, Daniel Mezick. Daniel, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to share as well.
Fantastic. So, Dan, for people who may not be familiar with you, can you give us a little bit of background? Tell us where you're coming from and how you ended up talking to us?
Yeah. So let's see. How did I end up here? A mutual friend introduced me to a mutual friend who introduced me to you. And here we are. In 2013, I was invited to the Global Scrum Gathering in Paris, France. Prior to that, I had been sending out some provocative, incendiary tweets about something I was working on, something I had success with around open space. I was kind of sitting on it as an idea and a kind of a secret. And I was getting retweets from some people in France. And then suddenly I got this email from a woman in France who said, I'm on the planning committee. I know you're sitting on something that's good and hot, and we want you to bring it to Paris. So you're going to get an invitation from the Scrum Alliance, and I want you to say yes to that. They're going to invite you to the keynote. It's going to come tomorrow or the next day. So I had to take it and put it all in a little book and kind of pull it all together as a thing. And then I presented it at the Scrum Gathering under the name Open Agile Adoption. And I made this little booklet, and I told everyone they were going to get a copy if they asked a question. This was in the first 3 minutes of the keynote. The woman in the front row stood up, raised her hand, and she said, I have a question. I said, what is it? She says, may I have a book, please? And the whole place exploded in laughter, and that was the beginning of the keynote. So that was the beginning of what became OpenSpace Agility. And in 2015, we formalized, the second more formal book called the OpenSpace Agility Handbook with my co-authors Deborah Ponce, Harold Transato, Louis Cole-Taylor, and Mark Sheffield. And since then, it's gone around the world as a thing. And people have been using this before-after open space structure that we'll talk about, I think, a little bit on the podcast, as a way of containing change inside a sort of a known container that has a beginning, middle, and an end that begins and ends in open space. So
now, for our listeners, for our listeners that haven't heard of OpenSpace Agility before, because OpenSpace, for many of us, would connote something that you'd see at a conference, law of the two feet and that sort of thing.
Right.
Which is, I know it's not, but what would you say that OpenSpace is in a nutshell? How would you tell the 30-second elevator pitch?
OpenSpace creates the conditions where reality comes to the surface very quickly, especially social reality. It manifests incredibly high levels of self-management and self-organization in extremely short periods of time, and does so in a way that generates high performance in organizations. Harrison Owen, who discovered OpenSpace, wrote a book in 1987 or so called Spirit. The subtext was development and transformation in organizations. This book predated the Agile Manifesto by some 16 years. Used the term open space about 45 times. About half of those occurrences were not capitalized. He was still formulating the open space, what became open space technology meeting format in those days. But since then, we found out that it has how can we say this? It has the power to transform your transformation.
Cool. So is it a physical open space, or is it like?
OpenSpace is a meeting format that creates the conditions for high performance through self-organization. Okay. So it's probably the most agile event or meeting format you could possibly put together. There's a fellow named Martin Weisbord who wrote a book called Productive Workplaces, and he also created a technique based on OpenSpace called Future Search. And he's the fellow who coined the phrase, get the whole system in the room. And this is an extremely powerful technique. And that's what OpenSpace is all about.
Yeah. That idea, get the whole system in the room, that's really, really powerful. Because, I mean, Brad, before you joined, Dan and I were going back and forth about our experiences with the transformations. And we talked about how I'm currently in the midst of a very large company. And the company, the departments that seem to be working not only have the leaders that are, which we'll get to in a little bit, have the leaders that are resembling the behaviors that we're looking for, but they're also talking to one another. So there is that whole, when you get to an enterprise, that whole finding the way to get the message across multiple layers and rows of people is pretty tough to do, right? I mean, so fire off an email.
It's shortcutting the Gemba walk, however you want to say it, and just getting everybody there and getting it dealt with.
Right.
Yeah. And there's a book out there called Rational Ritual that I think your audience would be really keen on looking up on Amazon and learning about. The fellow who wrote the book is a PhD political science professor from UCLA. And he basically says that ritual generates common knowledge. And common knowledge can be used to coordinate very, very large groups of people, even up to the point of a society or a civilization. So what we're doing in OpenSpace is we're leveraging that concept. If I report to you, and we're all in one big room in OpenSpace and attending sessions, I'm looking to see what sessions you're attending, and you're kind of noticing where I am, and I'm noticing that you're noticing, and you're noticing that I'm noticing that you're noticing. And there's this whole sort of thing that's generated, common knowledge across the whole group that is extremely powerful and extremely efficient for coordinating the group as a whole.
It's very meta.
Yeah.
The system examines itself.
Yes.
Yeah.
The system examines itself, examining itself.
You can see where that'll get ahead of people. So before we dive in the handbook, Dan, you start with an example of a typical Agile transformation. Anybody who's been through at least one, if not two, it kind of sort of gave me the heebie-jeebies because it to the T describes what we typically go through. And for those of you that haven't read the book, Dan and his co-authors lay it out as there's a formally authorized leader who comes down from the top of the mountain and says, hey, we're going to go Agile. Then the coaches start showing up and they start mandating how practices are going to work. Those that are further down the flagpole, for lack of a better term, they have a low sense of control. They have a low sense of inclusion. They really don't feel like they belong. And then that usually results in disengagement or unengagement. So people aren't involved. So I've been through this exact same, almost to a T. It's almost like a paint by numbers experience. And Brad, I think you've probably seen it, and I know a bunch of our listeners have as well. So Dan, how does OpenSpace help to counteract this typical, you're going to go do, and then just off to the races?
It does it by preparing the leaders for what's required of them to get a legitimate transformational change. So this is actually what it's all about. This is how it actually works. You would never engage in OpenSpace without a fully prepared leader, a fully prepared sponsor who understands what it means to invite everyone, understands what it means to allow them to opt out, understands what it means to have a burning issue that a lot of people care about, understands and, respects the idea that no one person has the total answer, but that the group as a whole's got it somewhere in their body. And that if we can get the whole system in the room, we can tease this out, right? So if the leader has been coached along these lines, the the event will be a tremendous signal event for the entire organization. And I want to say one thing about this as well. There's certain people who are, they will naysay open space or say this and that, or they might say something like, yeah, it's a good idea, but it's too easily gamed. In OSA, we begin in open space, we end in open space 90 days later. What happens 90 days later is people show up who experienced the first open space, and they show up totally gaming the second meeting. So the gaming isn't a bug, that's a feature. Okay, so they take matters into their own hands, and they go, let's do this, this, and this, and hack the culture of the second open space, and let's get our roadmap and the other things that we're not getting right now. And I'll go to your session, you'll go to my session, and these sessions will be in harmony, and we'll let's go in with a plan. Yeah, and that's exactly what they do.
So people actually learn to Brad's remark about meta, right? They learn to use the system to benefit themselves by using it. Oh, that's fantastic. So Dan, you just talked about 90 days later. So can you walk us through like a typical timeline where what the lead, because I know there's particular things you need to get ready for the lead up, and then go into the open space meeting, the 100 days. Can you just give us a little bit of background on that?
Yeah, so we probably should discuss open space itself very briefly, right?
Sure.
So open space as a meeting is an all hands meeting that is invitational in nature. No one has to attend it unless they want to. You would never have the meeting unless there's a burning issue that a lot of people care about, with high potential for conflict, where no one person has the answer, and there's a decision frame of yesterday that's already expired, right? So those are the basic conditions for creating an open space meeting. And of course, examining the Agile situation, pretty much fits the bill. So it's sort of a hand in glove fit for Agile work. Okay, next thing is there's an opening circle, and then there's sessions throughout the day, and then there's a closing circle. And the opening and closing circle, the whole group assembles in a seating in a circle, and there's a formal opening and a formal closing. That idea is also extended into this OSA structure. So in OSA, what we do is we begin in open space and we end in open space 90 days later. So in the first meeting, we basically tell everyone, listen, we're going to do some experiments here. We're going to try, this framework, or we're going to work with the manifesto principles. We're going to inspect all of this in 90 days. So if you enjoy this meeting, keep in mind, we're doing this again 90 days hence. And we're going to inspect the whole thing, and we're going to look back, and we're going to look forward in the second meeting in about 3 months. So when people get that message, that's when the fun begins. The other thing that happens is the leader also tells people, listen, this is fun. Yes, you're, getting, you're not doing your regular work today, but this is work. And we're here for those proceedings. Yes, there's food. Yes, there's beverages. Yeah, we're going to have beer and wine afterwards. But don't kid yourself. We want those proceedings. We intend to act on them. And those of you who engage big in today's meeting will probably get an email or a phone call about how we need you to help in the next 90 days. So when everyone gets that message, a whole bunch of interesting things happen over the next 90 days. There's principles in open space. There's a law, the law of 2 feet, which says if you're not getting your learning, you're not getting or contributing in a way that you hope to, you get up and go, needs to get up and leave and go somewhere where you can get those things. And then there's principles like, whenever it starts is the right time, wherever it is the right place, whoever shows up are the only people, or whoever shows up are the right people. Whatever happens is the only thing that could happen. And when it's over, right? So when people hear these principles, they learn that they are free and the normal rules of engagement are suspended, and they are responsible for their own experience. Yeah, So when that happens, they'll start to kind of light up when they realize, okay, this is totally different than a normal work day. Yeah. And then, from there, you get tremendous levels of self-management, self-organization. So that's what OpenSpace is all about. It starts and ends in a circle. There's sort of a convergence, and then there's divergence into the sessions, and then there's convergence at the end in the closing circle. OSA extends that pattern over 90 days. So there's convergence with the first OpenSpace meeting, and then there's divergence as we do the experiments and we work the 90 days. And then there's convergence at the end in the second OpenSpace meeting. So that pattern of converge, diverge, converge is a scale-free pattern. It doesn't, yeah.
And Dan, my question for you: so you have that first convergence, then you do the divergence where everybody goes out into their relative spaces, and then they converge again in 90 days. So during that middle section, that's where the for lack of a better analogy, the rubber starts meeting the road, right? That's where people are saying, hey, let's go and try this. And
that's right.
I think the exact words you use in the book, which I think are super powerful, you want to suspend disbelief and act as if. So,
right. That's right.
Corporate culture, we all know how corporate culture can sometimes get in the way, where somebody says, well, I can't do X because I know that, Brad tried to do that before and it ended up with his wrist slapped. So that whole idea of suspending disbelief is powerful because you're basically telling people, look, go for it, right? You have nothing to lose. We're inviting you, if I'm following correctly, we're inviting you in because we want to make this change. We are empowering you to do what you need. And if it's against things the way we normally do things, gratuitous air quotes, so be it.
That's right. Yeah. And but that's within, now the thing about this is we're doing this in a safe and pragmatic way, Jay. Specifically, we're going to use constraints, right? So the way that it works in OSA is, experiment with learning, use Agile principles, use the manifesto principles, and then do whatever you like. Well, guess what? The manifesto principles are highly constraining. So there is a very clear boundary around what's in and what's out in terms of behaviors over the next 90 days. And the manifesto itself it provides the constraint. So that's sort of the container that we use that guides behavior in OpenSpace Agility. And that's how we do it. We, inside the 90 days, we use the, do whatever you like, but don't offend the manifesto. Don't offend the 12 principles.
So use the principles in the manifesto as the bounding box, right? That's
right.
That's your buoys that you can operate in between.
Yep.
If you get a little bit outside, you are going to have somebody say something, but for the most part, as long as you stay within that context, you're good to continue.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. So you'd have delivery constraints and that sort of thing built in as well. That'd be part of the setup and out.
Oh, of course.
Obviously, we're here in business. So the developer's saying, "Oh, I've got free reign." It's actually finding those constraints as well, isn't it?
No, you don't. Yeah. So the idea that, we're Agile, so we don't have any constraints is just. I mean, we just call that we just call bullshit on that in OSA.
Yep.
I mean, to be clear, right? I mean,
Yeah.
So later on, like what this does is it allows you to use any framework, use the framework you're using now. There's a distinction between the framework and what we call the engagement model, right? So let me talk about that for just a minute. Most of the frameworks are silent on engagement or pay lip service to employee engagement. And we know from the Gallup organization, there's a mound of data that associates highly positive business outcomes with employee engagement. And the reality is that the frameworks kind of go like, magic happens here, just do the framework practices, and the magic happens here, except that it doesn't. So OSA is not a framework. OpenSpace Agility is an engagement model that you add to what you're currently doing. You add it to the recipe of what you're currently doing on the assumption that if the people don't engage, there's not going to be a transformation of anything at all. And furthermore, employee engagement is what scales, not your framework.
Yep.
When you started talking about and then the magic happens, I always think of, if you're a South Park fan or anywhere listeners to South Park fans, the underpants gnomes, who have that example where we steal underpants, there's that giant missing step, and then number 4 is profit. And I think you're right there with that rigid application of a framework. Well, there's the assumption of, well, if I slot this person in this role and this person in this space, it's automatically going to happen. Where there's that whole, and this is where OSA piqued my curiosity, is that there's that whole cultural shift that needs to come along with it. And I personally think it's pretty powerful to open the room up and say, hey, let's just try this stuff, and go do what you're going to do with this assumption, and let's see what happens.
Yeah. So go ahead, Brad, please.
No, I was going to say, I can just imagine, though, that for some employees and some bosses, this would be absolutely terrifying. This idea of
Yes and no. So in the new book, Inviting Leadership, which is a generalization of OSA, we discussed something called an exercise called the authority circle. That's in the appendix. It's a modified fishbowl. And what we do in that exercise is we teach the leaders that opening up a little space actually is good and doesn't hurt them. It actually enhances their prestige. It increases the level of control, and helps them to experience progress by unleashing, more and more engagement for very, very small units of authority, almost like a trade, like 1 unit of authority, 100 units of engagement, right? So we teach them how this works, and then how to safely and pragmatically do that. And we do that through this exercise. One of the exercises is this thing called the authority circle. The point you're bringing up, Brad, is really a key point. We have failed the executive leadership of the largest organizations. We have decided that all in the name of, quote, meeting them where they're at, close quote, we've traded away our principles and values, and we haven't taught them anything. We focused on transactions over transformations, and now we're reaping the results of that. So what's happened is we've reached a tipping point where people now understand, not just the practitioners, but the actual recipients of the services. The executives themselves understand something is terribly wrong. And in OpenSpace Agility, the prime implicant executive is the person who's been in a CTO or CIO role for less than 6 months and has done Agile a couple times at previous companies. That executive, when you come and explain how self-management's what scales, not your framework, engagement's what scales, not your framework, how are we going to engage people? How are we going to generate tremendous levels of self-management? It resonates with them. They are the ones. Okay, so each passing day, CTO, CIOs, their average stay is about 2 years in a given company. That's not a bug, that's actually a feature.
Okay.
Because as they move around, they now are, they're softened up for what we have to say.
That ties to a previous episode I think we did, Brad, right about when you joined us, where we talked about, there was a study that said CIOs, the title of it was something along the lines of CIOs think we're doing Agile wrong. And yes, it really came down to those type of, to what Dan, what you're saying, those type of interviews where they would say, I don't understand why we're doing this. I don't understand why we're doing this. And why are we doing that? And you could tell by the responses that some of the people were the demographic we were talking about, someone who's been through this a couple times, done a couple of laps. But then you also had the other part where you could almost hear the waterfall program management piece coming out, where I don't get why we're doing this. We have all these project managers. Because this is a development thing, like Brad said, this is an engineering thing. And it's really fascinating to see that almost dichotomy inside those ranks. And you'd think that, with the constant churn of around 18 to 24 months of them moving along, that would sort of converge eventually to a shared, like the shared experience, but it still is wildly different.
Yeah, well, We talked about, we mentioned culture briefly about 5 minutes ago, and I want to just give my thoughts on that for a minute.
Sure.
Okay, so culture rides upon the communication paths, right? So it's constrained and regulated by, like, what are the vectors of communication? What are the valid roads we can travel to communicate on? You know, what are the sort of communication vectors? Those are regulated by how decisions are made. So everyone in a hierarchical type company has had this experience where the boss says, don't go around me. And what that means is, whatever you tell someone at my level, you better tell me, so I'm not blindsided, so I know about it. Okay.
Yep.
So here's how it works. Authority distribution's at the bottom and is the foundation of everything. And then communication paths are built on top of that schema. And then culture rides on that. So authority and the communication schema are the substrate of culture, right? So if you want to change culture, you can do it instantly. Here's what you do. You change the way decisions get made. So let's take Scrum. If we're going to do Scrum and do it in a good way, we're going to go like this. What we're doing isn't working, or isn't working as well as we might like. So we're going to set it aside, and we're going to drop in Scrum. Okay, so what just happened? What just happened was the way we used to make decisions has been set aside. And now we're going to use Scrum to guide decision making. So the Scrum guide says, for example, for the product owner to be successful, everyone in the organization must respect his or her decisions. Emphasis on decisions, right? So if you do that, you will immediately get culture change because you've refactored the authority distribution schema, also known as the hierarchy, right? Yeah, there's a hierarchy, but it's a different one now. And the product owner is at the top of that food chain, right? So the product owner makes decisions about prioritization and what's valuable and what, all these kinds of things. And the teams make decisions about other things, and the Scrum Master makes decisions about other things. But if you do not implement the Scrum decision-making schema, you will not get the results you're looking for. What you will get is 12 to 15% improvement in everything you're measuring. So this is what's going on worldwide. Businesses are settling for a 12 to 15% bump in what they're measuring. And they're getting that from a daily meeting, a backlog, sprint planning, the demo. But they're not implementing the authority distribution schema in Scrum. If they did that, they would get a 100% increase.
So they basically changed their blocking and tackling, but they didn't really change their game plan.
Well, so specifically, they've changed a few practices, but the same people who made decisions yesterday make them today. And they'll get 10 or 15% out of that, and most businesses think that's great. So and then when the coaches leave, then it reverts to the mean again. So what's being, basically that 10 or 15% bump is being sold as transformational change. That is not transformational change. That's an incremental bump. It's temporary. And when the authority, when Elvis leaves the building, when the coaches leave, then it just goes back to what it was before.
Yeah, that doesn't seem like a percentage that would stick. That's more of, writing with your right hand instead of your left hand because it's more efficient. You don't drag your hand across the page and blur the lines. But when the teacher turns around, you go right back to write with your old hand. Right. Yeah.
The key thing is changes in decision making generate changes in culture. That's the point I want your listeners to receive.
Okay, so all around decision making, and that ties to. Go on, Brad. Go on.
I was actually going to say, so with the decision making side of things, is it part of the OpenSpace Agility as part of a risk management strategy almost?
It is.
Because
exactly.
We hear about the frozen middle, the managers in the middle who are fighting back against the new system because suddenly the authority balance has changed. So OpenSpace Agility is almost a straight out risk mitigation strategy.
That's exactly right. And what we do, I want you to notice something. In the open space is an invitational meeting. If you invite me and it's a legitimate, honest invitation, it's okay for me to opt out. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you invite me, you put me on a decision. So there's a transfer of this authority to make the next move to the part of the receiver. This is a really key thing. So when you invite people in open space, you're already engaging in a refactoring of decision rights, because nobody has to go to the meeting if they don't want to. And that includes managers, okay? Now, everyone's going to go to the first meeting in OSA because, like, if you're my boss, I want you to see me there. Yeah? Okay.
Right.
But what happens is they're mysteriously drawn into the open space vortex, right? And because we're framing it in a 90-day thing, in other words, it's not the rest of your career. In 90 days, we're going to inspect this. And by this, I don't mean like the product. I mean the process. We're going to inspect the process. So, like, routinely, what I do is I ask, when I keynote at conferences, I ask, how many people have ever been invited to a meeting to discuss the process of change? And I get, a whole bunch of hands go up, right? And then I go, okay, of that group, how many people have been to a meeting where everyone was invited to inspect the process of change? And then all the hands go down. Okay.
Right.
That's a big difference.
Yeah, big difference.
Yeah. So, what we're doing with this invitational meeting format is we're refactoring decision rights. And I want to talk a little bit about value streams for a minute. If you look at the way we make decisions, it might have worked in the past, but then after things change, the way decisions get made gets out of phase with the flow of value. And specifically what happens is the way decisions get made actually become the biggest clog in the flow of value through this value stream. So per the theory of constraints, I'm kind of going fast here, but there's a thing called the theory of constraints that says, for those who don't know, you look for the biggest clog and you get rid of it. And then you look for the next biggest clog and you get rid of it. And then you keep doing that over and over until all the clogs are gone and the flow is maximized. Okay. The biggest clog in most value streams is the way decisions are being made. So what we're going to do in a good Agile transformation is we're going to align the decision-making procedure to support maximum value flow. So when you, for example, drop in Scrum, that's what happens. Because Scrum is a decision-making game or schema that's designed to increase flow of value. Now, it's hard to do. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say, one of the things I know I've read recently in an HBR article was there was a big study that was done looking at decisions and what actually impacts. And the thing that made more impact on a company or culture or whatever it was that was trying to get from A to B was the speed of decision and not its correctness.
Well, there you go. So in Scrum, we have the daily meeting and we have other things that happen. Like if you use Scrum at scale, decisions happen very rapidly in response to change if you're doing it according to the rule, the basic, minimum set of rules. So what we're doing, I just want to put in a little plug here for a conference we're doing in Boston on May 14 and 15 called the Open Leadership Symposium. And at this symposium, we are exploring deeply exactly how you maximize decision-making speed in support of the flow of value, right? And it's through the use of open social technologies, things like Scrum, things like OpenSpace, and other things like that. This is how you get it done. So what we've done, like I said before, we've failed leadership, we've failed executive leadership in not teaching them what they need to know to maximize value flow. It has to do with decision making. So in OSA, we just basically say, we're going to use an invitational format. We're going to engage as many people as we possibly can. We're going to ask them for something small, like a 90-day commitment. And then we're going to ask them during the 90 days to pretend and act as if what we're about to do could actually work. And most people will accept that, which means you will not lose people. You will gain support. And most Agile adoptions that are done in the conventional way, assess, train, coach, and then force and impose the practices, the first people to leave are the very people who could power the transformation. The independent thinkers, the people with career options, the talented people. What they start to do is loiter by the exits. And then out they go as the smell of that, that smell.
Yep.
BS smell starts to pervade, the air. They polish up their resumes and out they go. What happens is we're left with the B, C, and D players. The A players went to the truly agile companies. So when we buy this line of BS about, that we can force and impose practices on people and everything's going to be great, a whole bunch of bad things happen.
That ties to the conversation we had before we started recording, where Dan, you and I were going on about some organizations look at a transformation like it's a program, and they fund it, and they give it a whole bunch of money, and they say, go do. And then everybody's a little bit like, to steal an old analogy, a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs, are a little bit nervous because when that funding goes away, somebody says, hey, we're just fit for purpose. We're good now. We can go away.
Well, that's why in OSA, in between the 90 days, there's this thing called leadership storytelling. Here, if you want your transformation to completely die, like just be dead on arrival, tell the leaders to do not tell any stories that support the change. That will kill it. Why?
I don't even know why anybody would do that.
Well, everybody does it. Everybody does it because here's what happens. When you introduce a change, people have to learn, and they're trying to sort it all out, and they're in what's called the liminal state. The liminal is the in-between no man's land between two steady states. So you're in transition, right? So when we engage in a so-called agile transformation, we're moving people into a transition state. It's an unstable state. They're nervous. They're full of anxiety. And if the executives are not repeating in stories and saturating the culture with generative stories that support the change, people are going to fill that vacuum with stories that do not align with the intent.
I love the author Terry Pratchett, who sadly left us a while ago, but he used to say that we're not Homo sapiens sapiens, the wise men. We're actually Pans Narans, the storytelling apes, and we convince each other with stories.
Yes, we make sense of the world through stories, and that's why storytelling figures prominently in OpenSpace Agility. And this is not an OpenSpace Agility thing, by the way. It's just a general transformational thing. Leaders need to engage in repetitively telling stories that support and don't impede the state of change. So the other thing about OSA I want to say is that it's a composition of existing elements that have been around, some for thousands of years, right? So we talked about ritual before. Ritual is an ancient cultural anthropology device that all cultures across all times and all places have used to make sense of confusing times, right? So we're using ritual in OSA. It's extremely powerful, right? And there's other... Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, if I'm going to tie into the ritual, I can almost see... I'm using a religious analogy here because we're talking about this ancient primitive side of things, that there would need to be a guide, a shaman,
That's right.
shaman.
That's correct. And that fellow is actually defined inside OSA as the master of ceremonies. So I'm drawing from a fellow named Arnold van Gennep, who was a Belgian living in France, who coined the phrase Rite of Passage. And then his interpreter and translator, Victor Turner, wrote a book called From Ritual to Theater, where he went really deep on this. The subtext of that book, by the way, was on the human seriousness of play. Yeah, Victor Turner. So Victor Turner basically said that people in groups handle transitions through a certain kind of ritual called the Rite of Passage. So what we're doing in OSA is we're creating chapters of learning that begin and end in OpenSpace. They have a beginning, middle, and an end, and they are passages. Yeah. So if we're here for 2 years together, we look back, we go, well, remember the first OpenSpace? Remember the second OpenSpace? Remember the third OpenSpace? That's when Bob came on board, remember? So this thing happens. That they can make sense of reality by using bounded containment and telling stories as everybody goes through it together. So, I mean, I can go deeper on some of the stuff. There's another topic called communitas, which is, it means the spirit of community. Ritual creates that. So this is all from Victor Turner. So what I'm telling you is that OSA is a composition of modern and ancient elements into a new composition, right?
When you talk about the liminal space, I think it was in your book, I saw it, and it actually opened my eyes, where you talk about how we're going through a rite of passage, right? And the remark, I think it was in your book, was made that everybody is in different places coming into the liminal space. You're coming from all over the place.
Right.
But once you hit that first open space meeting and you're in that window, you're all in it together.
That's right.
For me, that was one of those, like, common sense, how did I not get that? Because I think some of the problems we run into with transformations is we forget the fact that people came from all over the organization, especially like where you said that get the whole system in the room. We're forgetting that people are coming from different places and have different mental constraints, different versions of truth, right? And to realize that, just to see that written, to realize that, hey, we're all in this together. We're all in this liminal space. It's chaotic. It's uncertain. It's
right.
Undefined, unstructured space. That is very powerful, because maybe that recognition would help people lower their guard and lower their blinders and say, hey, we're all in this together and it's kooky for all of us. Let's just feel our way through.
That's right. So common knowledge, communitas, the handling of liminality and the anxiety that comes with that. If I report to you, Jay, and we are going through this thing where you're the sponsor and I'm some guy 2 levels down from you, we all go through it together. You go through it at your level of authorization. I go through it at my level of authorization. And years from now, we discuss it as if we were all there at the same time, at the same level of authorization. And that's because in OpenSpace, we were. We were all at the same level of authorization in OpenSpace. So I have 2 things to say about this. The first thing is the sponsor and the facilitator have special decision rights in OpenSpace. Okay, and then everyone else has pretty much equal level of authority to do what they want to get their learning and to contribute. So that's something that's very, very strong. It's almost like with Scrum, where like everyone on a team has the same title, developer. Well, everyone in OpenSpace has the same title, participant, member, yeah, except for the sponsor and except for the facilitator. So what happens is as you move through time in OpenSpace, authorization changes. Some sessions get more traction than others. Some messages and memes get more traction than others. And common knowledge gets built up. So, what we're doing in OpenSpace is something that's timeless and kind of ancient, right? We're going to trigger massive levels of self-management, self-organization in service to superior results.
Nice. So, Dan, we're quickly coming up on time, and I don't want to take too much of anybody's time, but you did plant a seed, a segue. You have a new book out called Inviting Leadership.
That's correct.
And I haven't read it yet, and I do want to have you back on once I get through that. But can you give us a little bit of insight into what that is and the difference between that and OpenSpace Agility and where you're going?
Yeah. So in 2012, I wrote this book called The Culture Game. Chapter 21 of this book was called Open the Space. There were many Easter eggs in that chapter. It was about using open space. I was already doing OSA and formulating it at that time, but I hadn't been public about it. The second book, the OpenSpace Agility Handbook, is an elaboration of chapter 21, a detailed elaboration with a structure. Okay. After I did this for about 5 years, I realized at the bottom of it is this inviting thing. Open space is an invitational social technology, right? Whole group. And this book basically says, engagement's the name of the game in large groups. If people aren't engaged, nothing good can happen. There won't be any self-management of anything if people aren't engaged. Okay, so to engage them, they need to be making decisions that affect them. The primary way to generate decisions right away as a leader is to mix in invitation with your delegation. So let's talk for a minute about that. Delegation generates like 1/100th of the feedback that invitation does. So if the new world runs on feedback, invitation is your entree into that new world as a leader. That's what this book is about, how to safely and pragmatically mix invitation into your leadership style so you can generate tremendous amounts of feedback, pivot rapidly, engage maximally as many of the people in your workforce as possible, attract and retain the best talent.
Okay. Well, I can't think of a better way to end it because you actually give us a segue to the next time we have you on. So Dan,
100%.
we typically give the last segment of our show to anything you want to shout out, any upcoming conferences or appearances. Where can our listeners find you? Where should they go if they want more information? Where should they start digging?
Yeah, so I would, if they want to know where they can get learning opportunities, I would say go to my Twitter feed, which is Daniel Mezick, at Daniel Mezick. That's DANIEL MEZICK, first name, last name. And then, all of the things that I'm offering are out there. The biggest thing I want your group, your audience to know is that we have a conference coming up called the Open Leadership Symposium. You can get to it at openleadershipnetwork.com. It's May 14th and 15th in Boston, where we teach the ABCs of how to use social technology to generate massive levels of employee engagement, self-management, and high performance. How to distribute decision-making safely and pragmatically in a way that makes it easy for leaders to thrive along with their whole organization. That's what it's all about. So we have some great speakers there. Speakers like Doug Kirkpatrick, who's acknowledged as like an expert in the world of self-management. We have a fellow named Mark Burgess who's got a beautiful piece of work called Promise Theory, which is all about human agency. And of course, my work and the work of others like Harrison Owen and others who are doing work in this space. So the Open Leadership Symposium, that's at openleadershipnetwork.com. Go to my Twitter, Daniel Mezick, at Daniel Mezick, to get the feeds on that. And then I do a lot of teaching of OSA online. So, every month I teach OpenSpace Agility. I do it 2 hours a day for 4 days. It's like a one-day class that's 8 hours long, but it's done in 4 modules. So you get an overnight sleep, there's integrations, there's deeper learning because you're learning 2 hours a day over 4 days. So I invite people to go there. If you want to see my training schedule, you can go to, again, I think the Twitter feed is probably the best entry point. I would just go there. And that's also where I, how can I say this? I express my many heresies.
We're big fans of attacking sacred cows, challenging shibboleths. I think is Professor Dave Snowden's line. That's how we learn, is by coming up with a novel opinion, and let's discuss it. So I'm going to take us on out. Brad, anything you want to say? Anything you got to pitch?
Nothing to pitch. Absolutely hit us up on the coalition, I think, is the one that I always say. I'm going to stick with that.
All right, thank you. So on behalf of the Agile Uprising, Dan, we'd like to offer you a sincere thank you for showing up. On behalf of Dan, Brad, and myself, I'd like to thank all of our listeners for taking some time to tune in. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a review, a rating, or leave a comment on iTunes, Stitcher, your podcasting platform of choice, as it does help others find us. There will be a thread about this podcast posted on, like Brad said, coalition.agileuprising.com. So feel free to hop in and continue the conversation. And last and not least, for those that are interested, we do have a Patreon set up for those that like to help offset some of our hosting and production costs. You can see show notes for details on how to become a patron. And Dan, I'm going to have links to all of your conferences, your books, all those. I have a running list here of things we're going to put in the show notes. We're going to put all that in as well. So thank you again. And until next time, this is the Agile Uprising podcast signing out.